please welcome to the stage Chairman of the RAPS Board of Directors, Todd Schermack.
Good afternoon, everyone. Did everyone have a series of great morning sessions? This is where you break out in applause. Yeah. Well, fantastic. I'm glad we're off to a great start. Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb. Dr. Gottlieb became the 23rd commissioner in May, and in his initial speech to the agency staff, he called this a time of great promise. Since taking over as head of the agency, he has identified addressing the national opioid addiction crisis and increasing generic drug competition and speeding new generics to the market as among his top priorities. He has an extensive resume. Having worked in many prominent healthcare roles, he is a physician, medical policy expert, and a healthcare advocate who previously served as FDA's Commissioner for Medical and Scientific Affairs, and before that as a senior advisor to the Commissioner. Dr. Gottlieb was previously a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a clinical assistant professor at the New York University School of Medicine in Manhattan. He served there as a hospitalist physician. He completed his residency in internal medicine at the Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York, and is a graduate of the Mount Sinai School of Medicine and of Wesleyan University, where he studied economics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gottlieb to the stage.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. This has always been a very important relationship to the Food and Drug Administration, so it's a real pleasure to be with you all. I know there's a lot of folks in the room who work on regulatory issues. Some of you have worked at the FDA or previously worked there now or worked at the agency in the past. Many of you work on regulatory issues with various entities in the private sector, and I hope you all think about the opportunity to work at the Food and Drug Administration at some point in your career. Having been at the agency now for my third time, I can tell you it's a very special institution to work at, very mission-driven, and the sense of public health mission that drives the agency and informs our work every day is really palpable, and it's very inspiring to be there. And so I hope you all consider an opportunity to come through the agency at some point in your career. I want to talk about some new steps we're taking with respect to clinical development today, and some of the technical things we're doing. I know this is a very technical audience, and I know you'll appreciate some of the work that we're doing right now. I want to start by taking you back for a moment to reach back across the history of medicine in order to draw some contrast to where I think we stand today. When you think about medical history, I want to start with the germ theory. The germ theory was first proposed in 1546, and it was expanded upon in 1762. But the ideas that gave rise to it were initially met with a lot of skepticism. Humanity struggled to understand how germs cause disease, and this disbelief had predictable consequences. Epidemics would continue to ravage society for many centuries to come. A transitional period began in the late 1850s as the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch gave convincing evidence that germs cause disease. Eventually, a golden era of bacteriology ensued, and the germ theory gained acceptance and allowed us to identify the organisms that caused illness. And the development of effective vaccines then came to fruition. It wasn't until the 1870s that Joseph Lister was instrumental in developing practical applications of the germ theory with the advent of modern sanitation. And in medical settings, we finally embraced aseptic surgical techniques, largely for the first time. So it took us 300 years from the first discovery of the germ theory of disease to see these principles established as part of the practice of medicine. It took 4 decades for our modern understanding of immunology to be firmly established, and then to be converted into tools that allow us to fully manipulate the human immune system as a way to cure cancer. And it's taken just 2 decades for the first mapping of the human genome and its translation into techniques that allow us to edit those gene sequences as a way to target deadly diseases that afflict children. There's a period of time between the discovery of a central principle of biological science and its fuller illumination, and its eventual translation into the tools of clinical medicine. This gap in time between the discovery of a basic scientific principle and the adoption of new treatments based on the original insight has been shrinking as science evolves. Primary ideas are more quickly reshaping how we approach illness. This simple truth is transforming human history. But at the same moment that we're shrinking the sequence of time between a basic science discovery and the creation of practical solutions for patients that are harnessed from these breakthroughs, the process for developing those opportunities is also getting more costly and more uncertain. And in many cases, it's also getting more prolonged. This is especially true when it comes to how new drugs are developed. We're on an unsustainable path in many ways, where the cost of drug development is growing so enormously, as well as the cost of new medicines. We need to do something now to make the entire process less costly and more efficient. Otherwise, we won't continue to realize the practical benefits of advances in science in the form of new and better medicines. Even when we can afford to develop breakthroughs, more people will have a hard time paying for them if we can't reduce the cost of drug development and find better ways to capture those savings. The high cost of drug development also reduces competition. With high costs, it can be less viable to develop some drugs, especially if you're second or third to market. Yet we know this kind of competition lowers prices. Also, because the cost is so high, sometimes a drug targeted to a less profitable circumstance might not be developed at all. This can increase overall healthcare costs by forestalling useful innovation. We need to reduce the risk and uncertainty that makes drug development increasingly costly and make sure that we have markets that are competitive and let us capture those savings in the forms of lower prices. At FDA, we'll continue to take steps to bring more competition to the drug market as one way to reduce costs and improve access. All the efforts I'm going to talk about today are not just about advancing science that could treat illness. That's a key part of our mission, but it's also about making sure that patients can have access to these opportunities. The same policies that we pursue as a way to help advance the science of drug development and make that process more efficient also have to be geared toward making sure we can lower the cost of developing medicines. Those savings must be captured for the benefit of patients and impact the prices in a way that extends access to these opportunities. At FDA, we've already announced a series of actions aimed at addressing the cost of medicine and access to drugs. We're taking steps to boost generic competition, and we will continue to build on these policy steps. We've also set our sights on the ways that branded firms sometimes game our rules to extend their drug monopolies past the point that Congress intended for. We're targeting these practices where we can, and soon we'll announce some additional steps to address these same goals. But we also need to address the other side of the continuum, where the costs start, with the high and rising expense of developing a novel drug. It's true that we've recently seen some targeted drugs move quickly through the development process. This is especially true for oncology. These are cases where the biological rationale for a treatment is firmly established, where proof of concept can be more easily obtained, and where the drugs are typically targeting significant unmet medical needs. But this experience is generally the exception. Even while some drug development programs move quickly, most take many years. The costs are also high and growing. There's been criticism of the various estimates of how much it costs to develop a new drug, but we know some drug programs can easily top $1 billion in just direct outlays. When drugs succeed, they're ultimately priced in a way that reflects a lot of the factors, including their value to patients, and especially the value to patients. But on some level, the prices also reflect some measure of the high development costs, and in particular, the cost of the capital that it took to develop them. This is how the economics of our entrepreneurial model works, but that capital is fluid. It moves across different opportunities, whether it's developing a new biotech drug or a social media site like Twitter. At a time when people are rightly worried about the rising prices of drugs and the impact on patient access, we also need to be thinking about these factors that contribute to the high cost of making new medicines. That cost of capital isn't just a reflection of the direct cost of doing the research to discover a medicine and the cost of running the clinical trials needed to test a new drug. In fact, In many cases, these direct costs are the least expensive consideration in the economic modeling that entrepreneurs shoulder when they're pursuing a new drug idea. That cost of capital is also affected the most by the risk of failure. As the risk of failure grows, entrepreneurs seek a higher potential return in order to support the initial investment. The cost of capital is also impacted a lot by the time it's expected to take to develop a new medicine. In a dynamic and competitive market, the capital needed to fund a new drug program is always competing against the next best economic use of that money. In other words, any investment is measured against the risk-adjusted, projected return on the next best opportunity. It can be developing a different drug or building the next Amazon.com. All of these factors affect how much investment we're going to see in endeavors that advance human health. They also affect the products that succeed. They also affect how the products that succeed are ultimately priced and how we make sure patients have access to these opportunities. Access is a critical matter of public health concern, and for these reasons, as a matter of public health, we must consider all the factors that impact the cost of new products, and that includes the cost of discovery and development. Last week, I spoke about some of the steps we're taking to make the process for preclinical development of new technologies more scientifically advanced and efficient. We'll have much more to say about other new steps we're going to be taking to achieve these preclinical goals. But today I want to talk about some of the steps we're taking to address the clinical part of drug development, the traditional 3 phases of clinical trials. First, I want to talk about some of the steps we're taking to modernize our approach to how we collect the clinical information that we use to make decisions about the safety and effectiveness of new drugs. And second, I want to talk about other steps we're taking to also modernize how we evaluate that information. This includes improvements in the tools we use and the parameters we adopt as a way to measure the safety and benefit and properly evaluate new drugs. I want to start with the first issue, the steps we're taking to modernize the way that clinical information is collected. FDA continues to advance the use of new tools in clinical trial designs. For example, we're seeing wider use of adaptive approaches, which allow scientists to enrich trials for patient characteristics that correlate with benefits or that help predict which patients are least likely to suffer a certain side effect. This predictive information is valuable. It can be incorporated into a new drug's label and help inform more careful prescribing. As part of these approaches, we're also seeing more use of combined phase studies, or what's referred to as seamless trials. Instead of conducting the usual 3 phases of studies, seamless trials encompass one adaptive study where the phases are separated by interim looks. By using one large, continuous trial, it saves time and reduces costs. It also reduces the number of patients that have to be enrolled in a trial. These methods are increasingly prominent in oncology drug programs. Under the leadership of Rick Pazder, our Oncology Center for Excellence is taking steps to better evaluate and cultivate these new approaches as one part of our ongoing effort to modernize our approaches to drug development. Owing in part to these leadership efforts, we've seen more sponsors develop oncology products that forego the conventional 3 sequential phases of drug development. They opt instead for seamless approaches. Under these trial designs, they'll typically add cohorts to a first-in-human trial to investigate doses and activity in a variety of cancers. These methods have been used with some of the newer immunological therapies. It may also be used in other drugs targeted against specific molecular defects. Seamless designs are particularly advantageous for drugs that work in a variety of diseases, allowing rapid evaluation of the drug and potential approval under our accelerated approval pathway. These new approaches are also highly consistent with the goals of the 21st Century Cures Act and the recently passed FDA Reauthorization Act. We've seen examples where this approach has allowed the rapid development of drugs in multiple different tumor types. If we had to stop and start formal phase 2 trials in each different organ system where cancer arose, it could have been a protracted process. This approach is also well suited to the kinds of drugs that are being developed now, where the drugs intervene on common elements found across multiple kinds of disease states. At FDA, we've identified more than 40 active commercial investigational new drug applications for large first-in-human oncology trials alone that use these seamless strategies. We're also advancing the use of master protocols to enable more coordinated ways to use the same trial structures to evaluate treatments in more than just one subtype of disease or type of patient. This approach is particularly relevant when it comes to targeted drugs. These are drugs that may intervene on markers that are relevant across many different disease subtypes. We may, for example, want to evaluate these different targets simultaneously as part of one large study. This could give us a better way to understand the comparative benefits of a drug across different settings. To enable these master protocols, it's important to do molecular patient screening. This can also lead to the development of a diagnostic that can also be used to guide patient care. We'll be talking more about all of these concepts and initiatives. We need to be mindful that these and similar new strategies also bring new uncertainties. These new uncertainties can create new risks. And so in all of our regulatory efforts, and in these as well, we must also take additional steps to make sure that we're protecting patients and ensuring drug safety. For these reasons, FDA needs to engage in more communication between sponsors, investigators, and IRBs, and other stakeholders involved in development programs when it comes to these new approaches. This is not a business-as-usual approach. It may require a much more iterative process with greater communication between all of the stakeholders involved in the clinical trial process. On the second point that I wanted to highlight today, we're also taking new steps to modernize how sponsors can evaluate clinical information and how FDA reviews this data as part of our regulatory process. This starts with better use of more advanced computing tools and more sophisticated statistical and computational methodologies as part of the drug development and drug review process. And this includes more widespread use of modeling and simulation and high-performance computing clusters inside FDA. FDA already has high-performance computing clusters. These tools help us develop more sophisticated methods for evaluating the data that's submitted to us as part of clinical trials. The computing tools also enable us to properly evaluate the more sophisticated components that are submitted to us as part of review applications. I'm directing currently an effort to try to increase our investment in these computational tools. They're an increasingly important part of our work, but access to them at FDA is limited. We're taking new steps to make sure our review staff has more access to these kinds of computing platforms. These tools are especially important to our use of modeling and simulation as part of drug review, not only in our Division of Pharmacometrics in the Office of Clinical Pharmacology, but across our review program. Almost 100% of all new drug applications for new molecular entities have components of modeling and simulation embedded in them. Typically, these modules are focused on similar uses. They include modeling dose response as a way to better evaluate the safety and efficacy of certain doses and help select the optimal dose for the general population or subgroups. They also include methods to estimate a new drug's effect size to develop appropriate sample size for pivotal trials. Finally, modeling and simulation is also commonly used to evaluate the reliability of endpoints, such as helping demonstrate a relationship between a biomarker and a clinical endpoint. We're going to be making more advanced use of these and similar tools as one part of our overall effort to make our review process more efficient and scientifically advanced. Among other things, we plan to convene a series of workshops, publish guidance documents, and develop policies and procedures for translating modeling approaches into regulatory review. We'll also be conducting a pilot program on these approaches. As part of this pilot, FDA will grant meetings to participating sponsors who use these approaches as a way to provide more collaboration on a model-informed drug development issues. Our goal is to see how we can accelerate methods that improve our ability to use these advanced tools to meet FDA's gold standard for regulation. These methods are being applied to both common and rare diseases. FDA is also collaborating with scientists to use similar computational tools to develop natural history models based on placebo arms in Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and muscular dystrophy. If we're able to make better use of rigorous, reliable, natural history models, especially for rare diseases, it can help us make the clinical trial recruitment process more efficient. We're also using similar methods to develop predictive algorithms, like those found in applications of artificial intelligence. To take one example, we're developing classification algorithms in lung cancer as a way to enable machine reading of CT scans based on widely accepted standards. These tools are still in development, but they can eventually be used to classify tumor dynamics like response to treatment and increase the precision of our assessments. All of these advances help make the development process more efficient and hopefully less costly. Additionally, to better delineate how we're going to approach the overall development and evaluation of drugs targeted to certain unmet needs, We plan to begin work on at least 10 new disease-specific guidance documents over the next year. Some of these documents are already underway. Among the diseases that we're targeting are areas of significant unmet medical need, like amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. This guidance is an outgrowth of a scientific document developed by the ALS Foundation that laid out some relevant principles. That document was developed with funds from the ALS Association's Ice Bucket Challenge that many of you will remember. FDA is grateful for these efforts, and the agency is responding to these efforts and the submission from the ALS Association with its own version of that guidance document. These are just some of the steps we're taking to make the drug development process more scientifically modern and efficient. We need to make sure that we're giving our review staff access to the best scientific tools and opportunities to advance their work. It's also the case that drug development doesn't stop with drug approval. We can and should learn a lot more about how treatments work in actual patients, in the real world, so that patients and payers are getting the highest possible value for their money. In all of these things, we need to make sure our own policies and approaches are keeping pace with the sophistication of the products that we're being asked to review and the methodologies being brought to these endeavors. Our work with high-performance computing and simulation is a good example of an area where we need to make sure that our methods match the sophistication and the resources as the tools and approaches being adopted by sponsors. If we fall behind, it'll be harder for innovators to bring forward novel products and approaches. It could also make it more challenging for FDA to adopt the most efficient and effective scientific methods and continue to meet its high standards. We need to do these things to make sure that we're providing an efficient path for the translation of cutting-edge science into practical treatments that are going to benefit patients. We need to do these things because the rising cost of drug development and its unsustainability and its impact on patient access. Unless we find a way to modernize how we approach our work and make more efficient the use of our resources, then we're going to get fewer medicines and higher costs as a result. We're not going to realize the benefits of the scientific advances we're seeing as quickly if we see them at all. Most of all, we have to do these things to make sure that we're efficient in bringing forward new scientific advances and opportunities that can benefit patients who need them. Thanks for having me here today. I look forward to answering your questions. I know I have time for questions. I'm not sure how we're submitting them, so I think, are there microphones?
Hi, I'm Shivani Chitalia, and I work for a CRO based out of Manhattan. Thank you for the wonderful speech. I had two questions. The first one being, does FDA foresee aligning its efforts with any of the other international foreign agencies to make the process more efficient for sponsors?
You know, the issue of harmonization obviously has been an ongoing issue for many years. I will just say the short answer is yes. I mean, we continue to try to harmonize regulatory processes, both looking at the kinds of preclinical requirements, areas where we can exchange expertise, and some places where we share data, some places where we try to put certain applications on a simultaneous review schedule. We've seen a lot of harmonization in the post-market around things we do with respect to GMP inspections and post-market oversight, where we share information and share findings between two agencies. I think that this is one of those ongoing issues where, you know, quite frankly, I think things haven't moved as quickly as we all hoped and we all want. And so it's someplace that continues to be a very high priority that I'm going to continue to work on.
Yes, and thank you, and I had another question as well. So you mentioned about the improvements from the drug development standpoint. Do they even include device development? Does that even include device development?
It absolutely does. I mean, I'm focused on drug development here because it's a little bit more of a drug discussion here at the conference. I'm going to be speaking, I think, October 3rd or 6th at a conference, MDIC, that I was just speaking about right before I came on here, where I plan to lay out some of the things that we're doing on the medical device side to try to make the device development process more efficient, and also laying out some of that at the AdvaMed conference next month as well. But there's a lot of activity we have underway that we're going to start talking about when it comes to medical devices under the leadership of Jeff Scher, and that program has been advancing a lot of new initiatives to try to make that process more efficient. And in summation, I'll just say that a lot of the issues around use of AI, modeling and simulation, adaptive approaches to trials, a lot of these were pioneered on the medical device side of our house, and we make more widespread use of them there. They're migrating into the drug side more recently. So a lot of these ideas really come out of the medical device realm.
Thank you.
Bill Murray, Medical Device Innovation Consortium. Your timing was perfect, so I was just going to make that comment, so I don't need to make the comment now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gottlieb, for your speech, and we've met in the past for the Patient Choice Act, which was introduced in several conferences or several congresses over the last several years. I wanted to know what your opinion was, and it seems to be very much aligned with the idea of conditional approval, much like they have in Europe. That kind of balances out that third leg of the stool from the financial perspective, and really provides that win-win for the small biotech companies, the patients, as well as the financial aspects of maintaining that path to market, and that they don't, well, at least minimizes the valley of death, as it were. Thank you.
Right, and I appreciate the question. I mean, this is a conversation we've had a lot over many years at FDA and outside FDA, and people have looked at various strategies. There are well-formulated strategies for how you might implement a pathway like that, and Europe has a pathway that embodies some of those features. I think that in all likelihood, it's pretty clear that it would take legislation to try to operationalize such a pathway. There's a lot of things we can do under our existing authorities to provide regulatory flexibility, but in terms of having a pathway where you're going to provide some kind of conditional approval that's an interim step before final approval, and you'll condition on certain restrictions you might impose on how it's used or how it's promoted, that would probably take a legislative effort. It's something Congress would need to do.
Hi. This is kind of a fairly broad question, but I was wondering, what are your thoughts about where you would like the commercial speech question to land eventually?
Well, I mean, it's a fairly broad question. I appreciate it. I think that this is obviously something the agency's been struggling with for many years now. The relationship between the agency's regulation and the First Amendment, and what constitutes constitutionally protected speech, and how much of that can be subject to the FDA's regulation under Hudson and some of the other precedents. I mean, it's very clear right now that the courts recognize commercial speech as constitutionally protected, and the agency, it's very clear that the agency's lost a series of First Amendment challenges. From my standpoint, what I want to make sure is that we have a legally enforceable set of rules that we're operating from, that we're able to use to promote our public health goals. And so we need to have clear regulation that is legally sustainable, and we need to enforce against that vigorously. And to the extent that we have certain regulatory parameters that either we feel or others feel is in conflict with the court's current interpretation, the court's interpretation of what constitutes commercially protected speech and the scope of FDA's ability to regulate that, we need to resolve that. We can't be operating from a platform where our regulations might be in perpetual conflict with the courts, and then we are reluctant to take action for fear that we might run afoul of the courts. We need to have clear regulation that is aligned with the interpretations of the courts around what is and isn't permissible, and we need to enforce vigorously against that. And so that's where I want to arrive at. I'm not sure we're there right now, having lost a series of defeats around First Amendment issues. I think it's fair to say, and I think most people who follow this would acknowledge, we're in a period of ambiguity right now with respect to these issues.
Thank you, Dr. Gottlieb. Firdaus Alfariq with MedTech Insight. Last week, FDA sent out notices to several centers asking folks about regulations that might be withdrawn in order to reduce regulatory burden. I was wondering from your perspective, one, what kind of discussions have you had maybe with the president about where he'd like to go see this, because that was part of his objective when he came into office? And secondly, are there any specific regulations, any areas of regulation that you think may be prime for withdrawing that would help the industries?
Well, I mean, the notice that we sent out wasn't just about withdrawing regulations, and I would point you to the post by the FDA's deputy commissioner, which sort of laid out some of the policy rationale. I mean, the notices themselves that appeared in the Federal Register were in response to the executive order, which directed agencies to put out some kind of public process to solicit public input around outdated regulations that might not be currently serving their intended purpose. But the exercise that we're undertaking is heavily focused on that question, not just what regulations we can pull, but more importantly, a lot of the focus, and what we've articulated if you read what we put out, is on which regulations might be outdated, which regulations need updating, which regulations no longer reflect current standards. It is the case, I mean, we look back and we have a lot of regulations that were written in the 70s and the 80s that, I mean, some of them are just no longer relevant because, commercial circumstances have changed and the regulations themselves just aren't relevant, yet they persist. I mean, those you'd want to pull. We have regulation that articulates products' standards of identity for cherry pie. That's a regulation that we currently have. But in other cases, and I think more importantly, we have a lot of regulations that haven't been updated. We don't have a sort of systematic process for every 5 years, every 3 years, saying, let's relook at these regulations and see how things have evolved, how technology has evolved, how the circumstances around how we look at issues of safety have evolved, and what steps we need to take to update the regulations. And so this is an effort to try to look at not just which regulations might need to be addressed because they're outdated, but also ask the question of whether or not we can get in place a better systematic process going forward as a regulatory agency to do this on a regular basis. There's been other periods of time where we've gone through this exact same exercise, where people have put out FR notices under both Republican and Democratic administrations and said, we want to look at regulations and see which are outdated and which need updating. So the agency, FDA, has undergone this exercise a number of times in its recent history. But I think rather than sort of periodically taking on this kind of an exercise, I'd like to see us arrive at a more systematic process where we're doing this on a more continual basis and asking this question. And sometimes we don't do that. But the thrust of the exercise is really geared at soliciting public input on regulations that we think can be modified to better achieve their public health purpose. That's really the thrust of what we're doing.
Thank you. Let me first just say that I represent a modeling and simulation and regulatory consulting organization. So first, I'd like to applaud your leadership in these areas. Certainly, we see the amount of advancement that has taken place over the, just the past decade in terms of acceptance and a movement to a better extrapolation and better understanding of overall risk-benefit. With that said, I still find pharma in general to be very risk-averse, and I just wanted to double-click on your overall message around the call to action. So changing guidances and getting out there and providing a roadmap certainly is something the agency has taken on historically, but I do believe that the call to action is on industry as well, to be bringing innovation to the table for the agency to consider. Is that clear from what you're communicating today?
I'll sort of echo some of your points. When I was at the FDA a decade ago, or the first time I was at the FDA, so it's a little longer than that, I think we first formulated the modeling and simulation group. We hired Janet Woodcock-Cedar hired a handful of people to create a modeling and simulation group. And the first place you started to see the application of modeling and simulation was in dose-finding studies. And there was resistance on both sides, on the industry and on the FDA. And I think by using the modeling and simulation in a place where it was an adjunct to a decision that was getting made based on information that wasn't always perfect, because finding the optimal dose is sometimes very hard, people started to appreciate it as a novel tool that could provide more and additional objective information to a decision that already was made in the absence of what most people would feel was sort of full information, optimal information. And so there was acceptance gained internally on the FDA side. And I think that trying to use the application there was very deliberate because it helped socialize the tool across the agency. And now, fast forward, and I'm back at the agency many years later, the use of it and the acceptance of it is pretty widespread. I'm sure there's still pockets of resistance on both the FDA side and the industry side, but there is much more widespread use of these tools across a range of different kinds of considerations and much wider acceptance on the part of the review teams. And there's a whole very large group of people who work on this who now are consultants to the review process who look at the modules that contain modeling and simulation to help advise the review teams about those components. And so this has now become a very ingrained part of the review process. And so my simple message to folks would be, 13 years ago, 12 years ago, this was highly novel, and if you included a module inside your review application that had modeling and simulation, and it was not looked at by the primary review team, and there was a very small team that could actually assess it. Now it's a very much a part of the review process, and they made the comment 100% of all applications for NMEs contain some component of modeling and simulation. So I would encourage people to think in innovative ways about how to use these tools. The group that does this is a very good group. They've got some of the most sophisticated and also expensive computers inside the agency, but they're heavily involved in the review teams, and it's a very sort of accepted component of drug review now.
So just to follow up on that, as we look at the change in guidance and the evaluation of policy, also looking at the process in which we engage with the agency, right? There's formal steps along the lines that when you look at adaptive trial design, you look at additional information that can be gleaned from advancements in modeling and simulation. Some of the stepwise approaches of engagement don't necessarily meet the flow and the flexibility that's needed in the future state. Do you see there being some changes in process to address that?
I mean, that's why I made the comment that we're looking at changing the nature of the interactions around something like a seamless clinical trial where you don't have the discrete, end of phase 2 meeting that you would have. So you don't have the discrete steps. We need to think differently about something that's an iterative process, how we embed back in the engagement. And so the short answer is yes, we're thinking about this very hard. This is one reason we're trying to develop a pilot around modeling and simulation to look at what is the optimal kind of engagement for sponsors who are trying to do something more novel with those tools and trying to get them looked at in an appropriate way that they inform the review process. That's the idea of creating the pilot. And so we'll try to address some of those macro issues that you raised in the context of that process.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Hello. You were addressing innovation and bringing down costs, especially to consumers. On I believe it's August 23rd, there was addressing the over-the-counter monograph fees to incorporate innovation. Do you have any updates to that process? The webinar was kind of, it's up to Congress, so if that's where it's at, that's where it's at, but just wondering if you have any updates to that user fee program.
Right, Dr. Woodcock's going to be testifying on that, I think Wednesday, before Congress. This is something that will require legislation, but it's been supported by the administration. It seems to have widespread bipartisan support in Congress. I'm certainly supportive of it and continue to advocate for it. I think this is something that will get done. It's going to require legislation to be implemented. I don't see any impediments to it. I think that we just need to work through the congressional process and make sure that we're properly providing information to Congress and briefing them and going through the hearing process and normal order. But I hope that we can get this implemented. Thanks a lot. Thanks for your time today.